let us start. If we want to talk about the Sephardic Halakha, first we have to talk about the definition of being Sephardic. Why do we use the term Sephardic, and what is the history of Sephardic Jews? So let us talk a little bit about the concept of Sephardic Jews versus Ashkenazi Jews. This is like the dichotomy, Sephardic and Ashkenazi. I mean, many other sub-definitions, and there are debates over what is the right definition for each culture. But for centuries, that was the main distinction, Sepharad and Ashkenaz. Sepharad literally means Spain. It's a term that appears in the Tanakh, in the book of Ovadia, and was adopted to, it probably did not refer to Spain, but was adopted by the rabbis to refer to Spain. And the term Ashkenaz appears in the book of Genesis, in the list of genealogy, the descendants of Noah, and also was adopted, probably did not refer to Germany, but was adopted by the rabbis to describe Germany. So Sfarad and Ashkenaz literally are Spain and Germany. I think that overall in the Jewish world, and even in the non-Jewish world, the stereotype of the Jew is sort of the European, sort of like white European, Western European people. And of course, that's part of what people call the Judeo-Christian tradition, Western civilization. I mean, all these definitions are shaky and very general, because when you start thinking about what is the origin of the Jewish people, where are we from originally? We are from the Middle East. We are a Mediterranean nation. And if you think about Christianity also was born in the Middle East. It's a Mediterranean religion. Islam was also born in you could call it the Middle East, the Hijaz Peninsula. Not only that, even the classic, what we call the classic civilization of Greece and Rome was a Mediterranean culture. So, in a way, instead of saying Western civilization, the real term should have been Mediterranean civilization. And there's a whole field of knowledge in history and anthropology that deals with that and studies the culture of the Mediterranean, which includes Spain, parts of France, Italy, Greece, the Balkans, Israel, parts of the other parts of the Middle East, and North Africa. And they all share a culture. Fernand Braudel wrote about that, and there's other people who study that specific culture. And on the other hand, also in terms of the development of civilization, Jared Diamond, among other anthropologists, speaks about the Fertile Crescent as the birthplace, the cradle of civilization. So there is, it's really ironic, because today when people speak of the Middle East is where all the, it's terrorism and primitive cultures in their mind, but really it's the cradle of civilization in terms of culture, religion, architecture, and many other things. Now, so when we talk about Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, first we have to look at where were the centers of Jewish population from the time which is historically trackable. We'll put aside what the Bible says, because there's questions about the historical accuracy of the account of the Bible, but most scholars agree that from about the 9th or 10th, I'll say 8th to 10th century before the Common Era, we know of a Jewish, or what we call Jewish Israelite population in in the land of Israel, in Judea, in the south and the north of Israel. And from that period up until from the 10th to 8th century BCE to the destruction of the temple in the 6th century before the Common Era, most Jews were concentrated there. But after the destruction of the temple and the expulsion by Nebuchadnezzar, people were expelled to the Babylonian Empire and probably were spread all over the Fertile Crescent, wherever that was the policy of the Babylonians. So, and also before him, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser exiled the 10 tribes, and it seems, it's hard to identify all the places to where the Jews were sent and where they were dispersed, but it seems that they were sent to the places which are today Afghanistan. They got to Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, those areas. They came back about 100 years later with the return from Babylonia and lived in, but still large portions of the population remained in Babylonia and in the other areas. In the 3rd century, in 323 BCE, Alexander the Great invades Israel and brings with him Greek culture. After the struggles and the Maccabean revolt and all that took place, after all that, the Jews sort of integrated into the Greek Empire, and one second.
Sorry.
So, like I say, Jews integrated into the Greek Empire, and actually, many scholars, the rabbis, fell in love with the Greek language and some elements of Greek philosophy, even though superficial reading of the Talmud and rabbinic writings will give you the impression that they were completely antagonistic, but it's not true. The rabbis were able to appropriate from Greek culture that which they thought was good, and reject some of it, even if not all of it. And we have writings from that period: Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish community in Elephantine, in Yev, in Egypt. But we move on. The Romans come to Israel. The Romans conquer Israel and then destroy the temple and then expel people. And with the Romans, Jews start spreading to the Roman Empire, which was much more expansive than the Greek Empire. And with them, wherever there was a Roman colony, there was also a Jewish colony. So more Jews came to North Africa and to Spain, to France, and to all parts of Italy, Greece, the islands in the Mediterranean, etc. However, some scholars argue that the arrivals of Jews to North Africa predated the invasion of the Roman Empire. Meaning, a lot of people believe that Jews came to North Africa with the Roman Empire. But some scholars believe, and I think among them is Hirschberg, it's in the book, that Jews came to North Africa as early as the 7th or 8th century before the Common Era with the Phoenician seafarers, and they brought with them their language, their language, their culture, some of their beliefs, and they assimilated into the local tribes, and which were called later, Berbers or Maori, and that might explain even why among the original population of Morocco that was not Muslim, there's still great affection towards the Jews. Morocco and in the other parts of North Africa, they had this very, very ancient connection. So, when going back to the time of the Roman Empire, it's an interesting fact. The Emperor Antonius, or Anthony, who lived in the 3rd century and was very close with Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, who was the author of the Mishnah, actually was friendly to the Jews because he grew up with Jews in North Africa. So, if you wish, the first Sephardic connection, if you get out of the boundaries of Eretz Israel and you go out, here you have an emperor who grew up probably in Libya, and with Jews in North Africa, and comes to Israel at a certain point and establishes good relations with the Rabbi-ovadia Sea. However, when we move on from that period, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, becomes a Roman province, and later on is part of the Roman Empire. Also becomes part of the Holy Roman Empire, which is converted to Christianity. Christianity is declared as the official religion of the Roman Empire. As a result, the Jewish center in Israel is weakened because of the animosity between Christianity and Judaism, and the center in Babylonia flourishes under the more tolerant rule of the Persian kings, even though there were periods of persecutions under Shapur I and others, but relatively they had more calm and more independence, and they developed sort of an autonomous state. That's where they were able to develop the Babylonian Talmud, which took a completely different direction than the Talmud of Israel, and established several great yeshivot, Sura and Hardia and Pumbedita. There were always 2 yeshivot at once, and the heads of the yeshivot were technically the heads of the Jewish world, but they worked alongside with a secular authority called Resh Galuta, the exilarch or the prince of the exile, and they ran a royal court with all of its elements. The servant running in front of chariots and royal garments, and fundraising all over the Jewish world, but they were also the center of scholarship and learning for the whole Jewish world. This period of the Geonim, that is almost, its beginning is almost parallel to the beginning of Islam in the 6th century, continues all the way to the 11th century, but towards the end starts dwindling because there were not enough great scholars to head the yeshivot, and the role of leadership was given more to administrators rather than scholars. But when we talk about this period of about 700 years of Jewish life in Babylonia under the rule of Islam, those were years of great creativity. The rabbis wrote commentary on the Talmud. For 200 years, they wrote anonymously and just incorporated into the Talmud. They were called Savoraim. For another 500 years, they corresponded with the whole Jewish world, mainly Spain, North Africa, somewhat also they had connections with Italy, even though Italy was more connected to Israel, and of course the Middle East. They even got questions or correspondence from Jews who lived already in Russia. Very few people there. And they corresponded with the whole Jewish world. People would ask questions, would send a letter to the heads of the yeshiva in Bavel, and that letter would take about 3 months in certain cases to get, because it would be delivered through caravans with merchants at sea. It was a very dangerous form of travel. A lot of this correspondence was lost. What we have left is collected in about 20 volumes of Geonica, the correspondence of the rabbis, and the questions cover everything from commentary to the Talmud, commentary to text, beliefs, superstitions, remedies, questions in Halakha. Of course, if you had a problem with let's say the kashrut of milk, or a mixture of milk and meat, and you want to know if it's kosher or not, when you sent a letter, you didn't expect to get the answer in time to be able to eat that dish, because by the time you got it back, it was yogurt or maybe aged cheese or something. But at least you knew what to do next time. And people asked, at certain points, people asked questions that laid the foundations for great works in the future. Such, for example, people sent the question to Rav Natronai Gaon in the 7th or 8th century of how do you say, we heard that you have to recite 100 blessings every day. What is the order of brachot? So Rav Natronai sat down and wrote the 100 brachot that one says daily, which is actually the skeleton of the Siddur. About 100 years later, Rav Amram Gaon responds to another question and sends a fuller version of the Siddur. Rav Shira Gaon in the 11th century was asked, what is the order of study? How was the Mishnah written? How do you run your yeshiva? And he writes a letter called Igeret Rav Shira Gaon that until today is the main source of knowledge about the period. To know not only the period, but from the Mishnah to the time of Aganim, almost spends 1,000 years with dates and names of the heads of the yeshiva. When were they born? When did they pass away? Certain struggles and things. So this was the kind of correspondence of that. But now one of the unique features of the time of the Geonim was extreme openness to secular studies and the surrounding culture. Extreme maybe when you look at the Orthodox Judaism of today, which is very reclusive and isolationist. The Geonim believed that one must be fluent in the language of the country, whether it usually was Arabic, but they were also very fond of the works of the Greek philosophers, and they were Jewish scholars alongside Muslim scholars who were responsible for translating many important works that otherwise would have been lost because of the animosity of Christianity towards that knowledge. But the Muslim and Jewish scholars translated them to Arabic, and that's how they were preserved for the scholars of the Renaissance, for early medieval Renaissance as well as the Italian Renaissance. Of course, the Renaissance did not rely only on that type of work. Petrarch and others went and searched for lost manuscripts of from the Greek and Roman period. But without the work of those Arabic language translators, much more would have been lost. And many of them were also very rational in their rejection of superstitions, and which were rife in Babylonia at the time, as well as the rejection of ideas of practical Kabbalah. They were not happy with that. When people sent, for example, they sent Rav Hai Gaon a question about a certain tradition that circulated in among Italian Jews, about a certain rabbi who traveled by means of the name of God. Basically, he, instead of beam me up, Scotty, it was beam me up by the power of the name of God, right? The time, like the quantum leap, Rabbi Rav Hai Gaon says this is nonsense. This cannot happen, and this you're granting humans powers that belong to the divine, and he rejected this completely. Stark contrast to what we find there in medieval times, where mystical traditions and superstitions that are whose source is pagan myths of in Germany and other places made their way into Jewish literature. So, what typifies the Geonic literature is that approach with a broad horizon, open mind, and willingness to incorporate all that is good in the surrounding culture. Now, towards the middle of the period of the Gaonim, the kernel of the Jewish community in Germany is planted. This is about the ninth century, and even though there was already a certain background that was different between the Jews that became the first Ashkenazi Jews and Babylonian Jewry, there was some difference because the as we'll see, the Jews who came to Ashkenaz, to Germany, came from Italy. Italian Jews were more connected to the Israeli tradition, which was not the same as Babylonian tradition, especially in philosophical questions such as God's physicality and the idea of anthropomorphism. Does God have a shape? Does he have a body? So there were different approaches between Rav Saadia Gaon in Bavel and the scholars of Israel and Italy and their own Germany on on sort of a medium that works and represents God. So there were some differences, but there was a rift that has widened between the cultural approach of the Babylonian Jews, or I will say, I think the more accurate term now would be Jews of Islam, Jews who lived under Islam, and that of Jews who lived under Christianity. Because I think for me, the main characteristic or the main distinction that we could apply to the difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews is that the difference between living under the rule of Islam or living under the rule of Christianity. That's the most important point, which must be studied. So, in the Jews of Spain and of North Africa became the successors of the Jews of Babylonia. As the sun of Babylonia was setting, the sun of North Africa and Spain was rising. First, it was the community of Lucena or Alisana in Spain, as well as Cordoba, and also in North Africa, Kairouan, Qalat Hamad, and Fez, all cities that were established by the Muslim conquerors of North Africa and became centers of Jewish population. And under the Muslim rule, Spain was conquered in the 8th century, and when Spain was conquered, the status of the Jews has changed tremendously, because under the Ostrogoths who ruled Spain before the Muslims, the local population was completely isolated from them. They came as noble tribesmen from Germany and controlled Spain, and didn't want to have anything to do with the local population. Even with the Christians, even with the local Christian population. When the Muslims took over, they already had respect from their previous encounters with the Jews to Jewish knowledge and intellect and tradition of organization and administration. So after the original clashes between Muhammad and the Jews in the Arabian Peninsula, they found ways to work with the Jews. So when they came to Spain, what they did was they asked the Jews to become their representatives. So there three classes were created. The Muslims were the rulers, the Christians citizens, and the Jews citizens with sort of a preferential treatment, where they are the intermediaries and the representative of the Muslim rulers, and that's where the period starts, what we call the Golden Age of Spain. It's also called Al-Andalus. Nobody knows exactly why it's called Al-Andalus, but one suggestion is that it actually comes from the language of the Ostrogoths, the German rulers, and it means Landhlut, which is flat lands. That's what they called Spain, flat lands. I think I mentioned in the reading list the book by Maria Rosa Menocal, The Ornament of the World. Highly recommended. I think it's worth it to study the period. There's other book, God's Crucible, Constantine's Sword. There are many books that Aristotle's Children, the Sword, all that will give us a better understanding of the period in terms of culture and development and so on. So, as I said, parallel to the center of Jews in Babylonia now, the centers in North Africa and in Spain starts gaining independence, and it was a natural process because up to a certain point the institutions in Babylonia maintain monopoly. We are the only ones who can teach. We are the only ones who have knowledge, and they also are the fundraisers. But as time passes, there are enough scholars who live in Spain or who moved from Babylonia to Spain and to North Africa who could develop their own communities. There's a famous legend that it's part true, part myth, called Sipur Arba'at HaShvuyim. Have you ever heard of that? The four captives, which does reflect a very sad reality that was true then, as much as today not so common, but still happens. And then there were people who were kidnapped for ransom. So ships who traveled the Mediterranean, and Jewish merchants from Iraq would travel all Europe and the Far East. So in many cases they were attacked by pirates who would capture the passengers on the ship, and they knew that usually Jews would be redeemed by their brethren wherever they go. So they would sell them, they would capture them on the ship, and they come to shore, and the Jewish community would redeem them. So the story is about four rabbis who were redeemed, who were captured, and then were sold, each one in a different city. One in Spain, one in North Africa, one in Italy, and then that's how they spread the wisdom of Babylonia to the world. As I said, it's hard to prove all the facts of the story, but some of it we know that there were pirates, there were captives. There's a correspondence from some of it that was found in the Geniza about raising ransom and paying and all that. So we know that really happened, and we know of some of the rabbis that made it. One was Rabbi Moshe ben Hanoch, who made it to Cordova, and one was Rabbeinu Hananiel ben Hushiel, who came to North Africa. So this is the story then of how the center of Babel moves slowly, and then later on in the 1300s, probably 12 or 1300s, because of persecutions in Babylonia, thousands of Jews leave Iraq or Babylonia and migrate, some towards Afghanistan and Iran, some thousands of them to Morocco, because that was a sort of an axis that Spain, Morocco, and Baghdad. People always traveled on that. If you look at Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Dunash ibn Labrat, many of the great Sephardic scholars would travel on that route: Spain, Morocco, and Baghdad. Now, North Africa was again. It's ironic when you speak the way people talk today about North Africa. When they think of a relatively primitive place, I don't know that many people know that the first university in the world was founded in North Africa, in Fez, by a woman. And it was a center of scholarship and knowledge. So North Africa was a center of knowledge, and as well as Damascus and Baghdad. But in Spain now, what happens with the Jews of Spain? There's because of the relative independence that they get under the Muslim rule, they start developing their culture, their learning, their independence, and then happens something that is typical to the spirit of the Sephardic or Sephardic Jewish scholarship, and that is the rise of Sephardic poetry. If you're not familiar with Sephardic poetry, then you could either open Rosh Hashanah Sidur, Rosh Hashanah or Kippur prayer books of the Sephardic tradition, or just go to Tel Aviv and walk the streets not far from the shore, and you'll see Rehov, the street, Rabbi Shlomo ibn Gabirol, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra. I mean, all the great poets are there. Not many people know who they. Some people know, some people don't know, but there were great poets. Hundreds, if not thousands, of poets who lived in Spain from the 10th to the 13th century. And not only do we talk about poetry as a vocation or as a profession, it was the center of cultural life. Besides the learning of Torah and other elements of Judaism, when Rabbi Yehuda Halevi traveled from Spain to Egypt, in his way, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is one of the greatest poets we ever had. When he traveled from Spain to Egypt on his way to Israel, he was held almost as a hostage by the community in Egypt. They wouldn't let him go, and as he was living in Egypt, he became the house of his host became like a center of pilgrimage of all the scholars in Egypt coming and writing poetry and handing it to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and it's like, the what they call it today, poetry slam. That was an ongoing habit in the. Can you imagine today a place where you have a couple hundred people gathered and they can all write poetry in clear Hebrew, biblical verse, and some of them were very, very adamant on not including rabbinical Hebrew in their poetry. So you had to know which words come from the Bible, which come from the from rabbinic literature. And now here's the important thing: what is the background of this whole thing? Where did it come from? There was poetry before the Spanish poetry. There is Jewish poetry. There is, and if you want to review Jewish poetry, there's a great book. It's the Penguin Handbook of Hebrew Verse. It's a nice anthology, but it's maybe 10 from each period, but more from the Spanish period. So we have, when you look at the Hebrew poetry, we have the biblical period. The biblical period there, definitely Isaiah and other prophets and Psalms, they're all great poets. As a matter of fact, some scholars show that Haim Bialik was considered the national poet, based some of his poems on the meter of Isaiah and other biblical verses. Then, after the Bible, until the rise of Spanish poetry, there was a genre of liturgy in Israel that became quite cumbersome. Very interesting, very intriguing, but not easy to read. The poets always prided themselves for creating new words new constructs, and the poem also had to be very intricate in including commentaries and allusions to midrashim in a way that you had to be a scholar. It was like a riddle that you had to decipher. It was like the way Google recruits new people by posting a mathematical equation on a billboard, and only if you can solve it, you'll get to the website where you could put your application. So the same way the scholars would write a poem and perform it in the synagogue, and only those who were knowledgeable enough to understand it would come to the point and say, "Oh, I understood your poem. You're amazing." And okay, here you have a little cluster of elitists to understand that. It was the first poem that we could define as maybe the first the true Sephardic style, or the first poet is Dunash ben Labrat. Dunash ben Labrat, who lived also on that route of Spain, Morocco, Baghdad. It's not clear where he started and where he ended, but we do know that at one point he was in Spain, and he had to flee because of tension with the officials, and his wife wrote him a poem of farewell. His wife, the wife of Dunash ben Labrat, is the first poem by a woman that was preserved, and it's a very high style and language, as good as her husband's poems, but we don't have much left of him either. The most famous poem that he left behind that we know is Deror Yikra, that I think many Jews know. Deror Yikra leven imbat. You don't know it? It is sung on Shabbat. Deror Yikra leven imbat. Okay, so this is the first poem. But what happened that caused that outburst of creativity? When we talk about hundreds and maybe thousands of poets, so there was a tradition of poetry in the Arabian Peninsula, in the what we call the Hijaz, which was before the rise of Islam. It was populated by Arab tribes, Bedouin tribes who practiced paganism, and alongside them who lived, Jews. A major part of the population of what today is Saudi Arabia, before the rise of Islam, maybe 50%, some people say even more, was Jewish. Some of them originally Jews who came from Eretz Israel or other parts, and others who converted to Judaism. If you look at there's a book published by Aramco and the Saudi government about the history of Saudi Arabia, and they just ignored the period from between the Roman period to the Muslim period. 400 or 500 years are not mentioned because they know that this is the Jewish period of Saudi Arabia, so they don't want to mention it. But Jews lived there. Their language was Arabic. They were integrated in the culture. And one of the main aspects of the culture was poetry. Poetry was performed at events, and people had to show that they could create verses and sing them. There were different styles, different meters, different rules on how to write the songs, the poems. With the rise of Islam, there was just like in other religions, there is a rejection of art because of the fear that art allows for freedom of the mind and maybe, God forbid, liberal approaches. So Islam tried to erase that chapter of its history and came up with a term called Jahiliyyah, which means darkness or ignorance, and that is the pre-Islamic period. So everything that comes from this period is not good, but people still wanted poetry, so they had to continue creating poetry. So they just they kept on doing it under the banner of Islam, but not all of it was religious. They wrote songs about everything, about horses, about wine, about women, about nature, philosophy, and they developed a theory. They also developed like the methodology and everything, and the in the Arab world, the Arab-speaking world, the theology or the opinion was that you can only write poetry in the Arabic language. No other language is capable of writing such beautiful verses as the Arabic language. And here was here is like I'm speaking more in length about that because this is really the I think the epitome of the Sephardic approach, and that is, how do you react to a superior culture, or to what seems like a superior culture? And to face a superior culture is a threat. If you want to maintain your culture, and it happens whenever two cultures clash with each other, and one culture has something to offer that the other culture doesn't have, then you could either move into the let's call it the superior culture and adopt whatever it has to offer, at the risk of assimilating into it and losing your identity, or you could shut yourself in, erect walls, and say, I don't want to hear anything about what you have to offer because I want to maintain my identity. There is a synthesis between those two approaches, which is to take the elements of the superior culture which you value and to appropriate them and make them yours. This was the reaction of the Sephardic Jews. Now we call them Sephardic because they live in Spain. This was their reaction to the claim of superiority of Arabic poetry. They said, okay, we're going to, instead of telling our youth, you're not allowed to read poetry, you're not allowed to deal with poetry, because it will pull you over to the Muslim side, and instead of being totally assimilated into the Muslim culture, which happened to some of them, we're going to learn and analyze Arabic poetry. We're going to appropriate it and do the same in Hebrew. And the result was that they wrote in Hebrew, in Arabic, and later on in the Romance languages. Poetry that sometimes was superior to the Arabic poetry. I mean, it depends on who you ask. But even if it's not, it's hard to compare, it is magnificent in its complexity, in its sometimes in its simplicity, in its honesty. They're beautiful poetry. What the Sephardic rabbis did was to show people you don't have to be afraid of being exposed to a different culture. That's the open-mindedness that is so missing today in the Orthodox world. But that mentality was really a continuation of the mentality of the rabbis of Babylonia. So, when Sephardic Jewry slowly lost its status, there were several waves. First of all, there were persecutions from within the Muslim world. There were two invasions, which came from Morocco, the Al-Muwahhidin and Al-Murabitin, or the Mowaheds and the Moravids, as they are pronounced in English. There were two extreme fanatic sects from Morocco that caused devastation in Spain, but people rehabilitated from that. But then came the Reconquista, which was the reconquering of Spain by the Christians, where Jews still maintained their Arabic roots, Arabic culture, but started living under the rule of Christianity. And then finally, the expulsion in 1492. But with the expulsion in 1492, this is sort of the end the end in terms of location of Jewry that was in place for almost 1,000 years, but that was in its first 500 parallel and dependent on Babylonian Jews. This is the Sephardic culture, and that Sephardic culture now spills out of Spain, first into Portugal. 6 years later, they're deported from Portugal as well, and they spill into the New World, into the Netherlands, into Morocco, into Syria, into Italy, and they're referred to as Sephardim. And the Sephardim carry with them also the Mediterranean tradition of the Babylonian Jews and the Jews who lived under Islam. So that is, in my opinion, when we speak about Sephardim, it doesn't have to be necessarily someone who came from Sepharad. If you ask where your ancestor came from, right, and maybe you'll go to my heritage and you'll find, a whole, a panoply of origins. But even if my ancestor did not go through Sepharad, in my theology and philosophy and understanding of Judaism, I am a Sephardic because I would be more open-minded and more accepting to different cultures and opinions, and without thinking that accepting one means that I have to reject Judaism or observance. And that, I think, is the power of the Sephardic tradition, which now, unfortunately, has been constantly eroded. I would say in the last, first in the last 250 years, because of imperialism and because of the encounter of the West with the East, where the West was at a vantage point, and secondly, after coming to Israel, the fanatic tendencies, the extremist tendencies, and the sort of obliteration of the more flexible Sephardic tendencies of the past. So this is something that maybe needs to be revived. I would say, let us take a short break here,